Welcome back to Crafting a Meaningful Life. Well, I've been crafting a meaningful life. So let's address the elephant in the room first before we go any farther. Last Friday, I had hand surgery. I went in and I had kind of lost the use of my hand. As most of you know, strength training is so important to me, and I couldn't grip the weights anymore. And when I dropped one, I realized this was dangerous and I had to stop. But I went to see a surgeon and he said, I think I can help you. And voila, here I am 3 days later. We'll see what happens with physical therapy and regaining the use of my hand. So try not to pay attention to the elephant in the room while we're recording. And instead, I want you to focus on my beautiful guest today. Welcome, Dr. Golden.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Mary. It's good to be here.
Dr. Golden, can I call you Tasha?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, some doctors are like that, They want to be called, I'm sorry, I am Dr. So-and-so, but...
Sure, they earned it. I guess if that's what helps them out, then...
Well, I feel like that having talked with you enough that, Tasha, we are on a first name basis, and that your story is something I am so excited to tell to my listeners, because it is sometimes the people who are on my podcast tell a very personal story of going through their own personal struggles and how they came on at the end. Mm-hmm. Your journey has a little bit of that in it, but it is a little bit more involved. I mean, for crying out loud, you started out as a folk singer composing music, and you thought that was going to be where your life was going to end up, and now you're Dr. Tasha Golden, and you are doing amazing worldwide things. So let's start and tell my listeners a little bit about that journey, because I want them to catch up of the vision that what's possible.
Yeah, the work that I'm doing now was definitely not what I thought I was going to be doing when I started out. From the time I was a really little girl, I wanted to write songs and travel around the world and perform them. And I worked toward that all through my youth, and I got to do that for a lot of years, touring as a singer-songwriter. Got to work with some really amazing musicians and songs and TV and film and things like that. And wow. That's the work that I loved and the work that I thought that I would be doing until I died. But right. Two things happened. The first is that, as a songwriter, I wrote songs that were about difficult experiences in my life. That was part of how I processed those things and how I figured out that I could share them with other people. And so I had songs that were about my experience of depression or, my family's history of domestic violence. And when we toured everywhere that we went in the world, from, Nashville to Beijing, those were the songs that people would stay after concerts wanting to talk with me about. And people would share really personal stories about their own experiences with these kinds of things, from, suicide ideation to abuse histories, all kinds of things. And often they would follow up their story by saying that I'm the first person they had ever told about those things. And wow. That was such an honor to me, of course, but it also started me wondering, why is that? What is going on in the space of a music venue, or, what is it about a singer or a song that makes some things speakable for literally the first time? Why are people able to share things with me that they had never shared with a doctor or a therapist, not even a spouse or a partner, right? And I got really interested in what that meant for people's ability to access help and care. If there are things that your therapist doesn't know about you and your life, that's less ways that they can help you. And the same with a physician, the same with a friend, right? And so it kind of started, it began to be very apparent to me that there's something happening in the realm of music and the arts that's essential to how we know ourselves and how we, connect with each other, that isn't necessarily being integrated into some of the essential spaces in our lives, whether that's healthcare or education or even our homes. And I just got interested. I wasn't sure what that was going to mean for my life, but I was interested, right? And then the other thing that happened was that I, the hustle of the music industry, the way that it can be so unpredictable. You're out on the road all the time. You're away from things that you know and people that, can ground and support you. And all of that over the course of many years drove me into significant burnout and major depression, and I could not keep touring. There was a time when I couldn't get out of bed for weeks, let alone play shows. And it became clear that however much I had wanted this career and however much it meant to me and however much I identified with it, this was not going to be my future. There was some other, this was not going to be it. I couldn't keep doing this. And there was a time I didn't know, if that's not in my future and that's the only thing I've ever wanted to do, I don't know if I want a future. I don't know who I am, and in that time, what I kind of came back to was my interest in what was going on at those concerts. Why were people able to talk to me? Why was I able to say things in music that I hadn't said before? There were things that I told rooms of a few hundred people before I had told a single friend, Why was that happening, and what did it mean for our health and well-being? And, it's a long, kind of weird, complex story, but I kept pulling on the threads of those questions until I wound up with a PhD in public health, specializing in the impacts of, creativity and arts and aesthetics and design on our health and well-being, how we connect, and even on things like leadership and change. How do these things help us to know ourselves and each other and figure out what kind of world we want to live in?
When you talk about this in a music venue, and I think anyone who's listening, that when I think about concerts that I've attended and how I can be caught up in this sound, in the music, in the unity of the people who are watching, there's this sense of we are experiencing and listening in oneness that sometimes you don't experience in a lot of other situations, but music can evoke that. And I'm really curious about this, Tasha. So what did you come up with in terms of why does this happen in a concert? Is it just your concerts, or can it happen with everyone's concerts? Is it the sound? Is it allow us to let down our barriers? What's happening that people were experiencing that?
Yeah, those are such important questions, and I think what listeners might intuit as they listen to us talk about this, what they think might be happening to them when they're in those kinds of spaces like what you're describing, is probably spot on. It's just that it's taken the science a little bit to kind of catch up and be what are we seeing here? How can we measure it? And I might, answer your question by zooming out just a little bit to say, at the most basic level, human beings evolved to make and share art for a reason. If this didn't do something for our survival, we would have stopped doing this millennia ago, right? So there must be some reason why we need art, music, these kinds of things that might seem, in some cases, indulgent. This isn't a survival thing. This is an extra, But if it were truly an extra, we wouldn't have records of humankind doing this,
right,
from the beginning, right? So there's something that's essential about it. And part of what is essential about it is that it expands our capacity for communication. There are some things that are too big for just linear conversation like what you and I are having right now, right? And that can be from the good to the bad, somebody who's ecstatic or just really in love. There's a reason why people dance. There's a reason why people jump up and down, right? There's something that the body and that words can't contain that has to come out in some way that gets communicated. And, that's also
so you've
true
seen me on the dance floor. Is that what you're saying?
Maybe. Yeah. And really serious, difficult things too, that when we try, we see that when people, we see people run into problems and into hardship when they think that if they've gone through something difficult, if they have a hard time talking about it in this kind of way, this conversational way that you and I are talking right now, they think that something's wrong with them or something has gone wrong or that they're broken or that they're messed up. Why can't I figure out how to talk about this? Or maybe I'm just really shy, or maybe this is just a subject matter that nobody should ever try to broach. This just is not appropriate for conversation. And in some cases, they might be kind of right that maybe what they're going through is something that deserves and warrants expression in some other way. And that's why art exists. There are things that you can express with visual art or with movement or with music that either cannot be expressed verbally or don't feel adequately expressed verbally, or there's some need that we have. You might think about art as a kind of communicative technology almost that we evolved to be able to process and share and even just bear witness to the human experience, which is, after all, very complex and vast and difficult and possible to contain in a small way.
I think about for example, I live in the West in Utah, and the Anasazis who were in southern Utah and left their drawings for us on the rocks and the sculptures down there. And when I'm there and I'm walking out there in nature and I'm seeing them, there is this sense that I don't know if they thought they were leaving their mark for the 21st century. I don't know that, okay? But I do think they had a desire to communicate what they were experiencing and to leave their mark. They etched it not in sand, but in stone.
Yeah.
And that desire to communicate, I think, has stayed with us through all these centuries. To say, I was here. I felt. This is what I did. This was my life. And some people are not able to carry on a conversation like you and I are right now. And what you're saying then is, by providing these other venues for them, these other platforms, that people can discover what, Tasha?
There's, I've explored this in a few different ways, so I'll give you an example. Early on, after I had left my life on the road, I created a program called Project Uncaged. It's a trauma-informed creative writing program for girls that are incarcerated or justice involved in some way. And they would often share things in their poems and songs that, like me, they had never shared with anybody before, or they certainly hadn't talked about, within the environment of this facility that they were stuck in, or maybe that they hadn't communicated to a family member or to like a probation officer, things that might be really important for them to get the help or the resources that they need, but yet weren't coming out in any other way. And again, I found myself working with those girls over years was a big part of why I continued to, invest in this kind of work. What is it that comes out? What is it that we learn? And a lot of times what you see is people turning to creative writing or creative mechanisms when something feels stigmatized, something feels difficult to put into words because there's some kind of hesitance or shame around it. And we also see people turning to creative mechanisms when what they're feeling just seems too big, so they wind up using metaphor or story to try to encapsulate how big or unnavigable something kind of feels to them, right? Or there are times when people really need to say something without saying it. Like, how can I express to you that I'm feeling a certain way without giving you all the details of what happened to me? Because giving you all the details might be re-traumatizing, and I can't go there, but I do want to connect over how I feel. And we see that a lot. Your listeners no, there are so many songs, there are so many paintings that evoke a certain emotion, but you couldn't look at that song and say, like, I know exactly what happened to that songwriter. They're referring to this event, and then somebody said this thing, and then this thing happened. Like, we don't actually know event after event, cause and effect, but we know what the person means, we know what they're feeling, and we can feel it too, and we can connect. And I wound up taking some of that experience with Project Uncaged into my research later on to look at if we're looking at complex issues, like one of my studies was about people's experiences of violence. That's a really difficult thing to talk about. So can we study people's exposure to and experiences of violence in a given city, but use both our conventional methods, like surveys, where we might just ask them straightforward questions, and some arts-based methods where they can write creatively about their experiences. And by combining those, we get better data all the way around. That's always great to use mixed methods, but also it let me compare the two to each other. What did people tell us via the art that they did not tell us otherwise? And we did get about 50% more data from the art. We also saw some experiences of violence that didn't emerge at all in the surveys. There were, one example, we were looking at girls' experiences of violence, and the main issue that they brought up was intimate partner violence. That was their major experience with violence and their major concern. And the surveys that had been administered among youth at the same time in the same city didn't ask about that form of violence at all. It asked about other forms of community violence. And so we were able to see that, those surveys were missing the priority issue for 50% of the population. And why would that be? That's a combination in that case of the survey not, the people who created the surveys maybe not tuning into what we might need to be asking about with these young people, but also young people having an opportunity to say what they needed to say on their own terms, in their own way, which made them feel safer and have more control and power over how they shared their stories and how they shared their anxieties and fears. So when we give ourselves that space, it's a way to know ourselves, and it's a way to know each other, not only in a kind of personal life way, but literally the data that we have as a society in order to create better solutions and resources for our whole population.
I love that. And the variety of ways that you have used to help people express those feelings. For example, for you, it began with song and verse and be able to write it and to sing it. Other people might say, that's not my thing. Well, their thing might be then the drawing, and other people would be like me, who would say, my drawings all look like Picasso did them. But movement for me is very expressive, and I just love to be in my garden and playing my music and just moving however my body feels like moving, and touching what it touches, and brushing along the leaves. And for me, that's a very beautiful, expressive way. Other people might feel very clunky with that. And so writing, they might want to just... I think a lot of people shy away from writing because writing was always criticized as a child. Either their penmanship wasn't
in school,
and it wasn't this. It was you didn't express. I'm sorry, your grammar wasn't right, your spelling wasn't right, and nobody could read your writing, and all those kinds of things. But when we take away those pieces, writing, I have seen, like even in our local prisons here, the kind of programs that they have in getting people to write without judgment.
Yeah. Not everything has to wind up being some kind of product that you can monetize. There's a lot of humanity that we get a chance, in my work, I get a chance to kind of bring people back to too, that there's a purpose behind the things that we make that can supersede just a kind of capitalistic, I need to make money sort of scenario. And of course, that is not at all to diminish the importance of people having enough to live on. That's, as a starving artist for many years, something that I relate very powerfully to. But there's also this idea in our society in general that often we downplay the things that can't be understood in terms of making money, the things that aren't part of like quote unquote productivity. And we even mean that sometimes. Productivity itself is sometimes associated with making money versus the productivity of developing a new relationship with somebody or nurturing a relationship, the productivity that comes from caring for, an animal or a garden, or learning something for yourself, growing in some way. That too is productive. But in our culture, we tend to really diminish what a human life is about. And it's not our fault. These are narratives that we receive, right? We kind of born into them. And it can be kind of difficult to help people to reconnect with themselves and the things that they're interested in just as human beings. Like, you are a creature, you are not a robot. What does, what Mary Oliver called the animal of your body, what does it love to do? What does it want to do? And sometimes these conversations about the impacts of the arts on our health and well-being can help people to even just feel a little sense of permission behind that. Like, oh, okay, if the point wasn't to be good at something or to try to ultimately sell something, what interests do I nevertheless have? What do I find fun to do? If there were no judgment and I didn't have to be quote unquote good enough, if just doing it were its own reward, what are the kinds of things that I would love to do? And sometimes those things don't fall under the umbrella of what a lot of people would call art. My definition of art and culture is extremely broad and kind of anthropological. So most things that people enjoy, I would wind up describing as arts and culture in some kind of way. But even if there are things that you love that you wouldn't describe that way, it's important for our health and well-being to be able to reconnect with not only how we become productive in the way that culture demands of us often, but how we live a life that's meaningful to us, to the point of your podcast, right? How do we craft something that's meaningful to us? And what does that mean?
It's interesting, Tasha, that even at my age now, 71, I am still in this process of crafting this meaningful life. And on my podcast last week, I had a woman who point blank said to me, as we were going through some pretty deep stuff, she said, what would it be like for you, Mary, if you didn't see the world through the lens of ambition? And I felt like someone had just hit me with a bat right here in the middle of my chest.
Oh, wow.
And it is that monetization type of piece. In order to have value, it's not just like, oh, today I'm feeling blah, 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 you know what I mean? But how can I monetize that? Or how does someone put worth to anything that I might express if it's not monetized, if it can't be monetized?
Yeah.
And so I have spent this last week, I know how to roll out the carpet. I've been rolling out carpet my entire life. But what I didn't know how to do, and I'm still learning, is how to roll it up. How to roll up the carpet through the lens of ambition and just be able to be.
I love that metaphor. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, it makes me think of in my work, I'm in public health, and I'm often helping people connect creativity and well-being through the science of how creativity affects our well-being. And as part of that, I often share the World Health Organization's definition of health. Like, if we're going to talk about health, we have to start with, like, what the heck is it?
Yeah.
And their definition...
I don't think I know, so share, please.
Yeah. From the 1940s, they said, health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. So health is not just the absence of things we don't want. It's not just preventing things we don't want or treating and healing things we don't want. It is the presence of complete, and that is a very high bar, complete physical, mental, and social well-being. And often with my audiences and my clients, I'm helping them look at, okay, if health is both the absence of suffering, maybe we might say, although some people would argue maybe suffering is maybe part of the human experience, right? But
I don't think
health is.
I don't like the word suffering, but I like the word struggle.
Yeah, and like the
suffering
Buddhists
to
would say,
me is like, but
maybe
struggle.
rumination,
I
adding.
I can walk through struggle. Struggle does not equate to failure.
Yeah. I was going to say, the Buddhists often say that pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. So we can kind of wrap that into the definition. But if we also say that health is the presence of well-being, we have to ask ourselves what that is. And I get to ask audiences all over the world, what does well-being mean to you? If it's not just the absence of suffering, what is well-being? And as you can imagine, people around the world have very different understandings and interpretations of this. They're diverse and fascinating, but they do cohere around some themes that I think your listeners will resonate with. People say that well-being is having a sense of meaning and purpose. It's having a sense of belonging, of being part of something bigger than yourself. Well-being is having a sense of self-worth that isn't affected by external things, that you have value. People say that well-being is being able to experience beauty, being able to be creative, being able to have agency and influence over things that matter to you. So these are some of the ways that people describe well-being. And what I appreciate about being able to look into that definition of health as being two parts, it's well-being and it's the absence of, you might say, disease, infirmity, injury, things like that. If well-being is both of those, then we start to imagine our lives in the world in a different way. That it's not just about what we want to avoid, that it's about what we want to create. And we also start to realize that none of us, as much as we, as much philosophically and individual growth that we can do to cultivate lives that have that well-being for ourselves, this is also a collective endeavor that, all of us together have to be willing to imagine what kind of community would have to exist for the people in that community to have complete well-being and not just the absence of disease. What kind of world would have to exist? And how do we build that world where humans are not only maybe free of illness, maybe not only, not dying young or things like that, these things that we can prevent, but are also experiencing a life that we could call thriving or flourishing, to have complete well-being? What would that look like? And that always opens up our imaginations as far as how we want to live our own lives and what we want to build together, what we think is worth our time and our effort, what kind of world do we want to live in. And that's where that kind of like that piece of creativity and well-being really comes together, is that creativity isn't just, it's both how it affects our brain and body, like having a chance to express yourself and how that makes you feel, or seeing other people express themselves and how that makes us feel and connect with one another. It is all of that. And then it's also, what do we even imagine is possible? Do we have enough creativity to tell different stories about our lives and about the communities that we live in and about the worlds that we're building together? That's a capacity that I love to work with leaders and organizations on. It's not just, how can you use creativity in the arts to feel better right now, but what is our capacity to be able to see ourselves anew and to imagine, no matter what age we are, to your point, like, what could my future hold? What is the story that I want to tell from here? And do that for our organizations, for our communities, for our societies.
I'm just like so many questions. I mean, my mind is just going crazy. The first thing when you said that this was the definition that the World Health Organization came up with in 1940, if I hadn't have been on camera, you would have saw my jaw drop to the floor. Because I would have said 1940? You mean in 1940 we were thinking that it was not just about trying to prevent something, it was drawing in the goodness of life? For me, that's a very Eastern type of philosophy that was not incorporated into Western civilization. And now we are seeing Western civilization embrace that. But in the 1940s, never. I was born in the 50s, and no one ever talked to me about what can you create in your life, Mary, that will bring you fullness and completeness. I didn't start really looking at those things until I was 50. And I am, the fact that you have been around the world talking about these things and that people have responded to you brings such hope to me. Because sometimes, Tasha, if we just look at the news, there's no hope. There's just no hope out there. Just like, cash it in right now. But when we actually talk to people like you, who are talking to actual human beings around the world, and that question is posed, what would you want to create in this community so that you are creating completeness? And I would venture to say those answers that you gave, belonging, wholeness, those things, that they transcended cultural, economic, physical type of barriers, that they are universal.
Yeah, absolutely. And these things that we intuit as human beings, that it would matter to us whether we have meaning and purpose, we can measure that now, that literally the having a sense of meaning and purpose has measurable impacts on your psychological health and even on your physiological health. So these things that humans know, if you pose the question to any of us, like, what is it that you would need in order to have, like, what does well-being mean to you? And even things like social connection, a lot of times people define well-being and they will say things like, well-being means having support when you're going through a hard time. And that's always fascinating to me, because implicit in that definition is that you're having a hard time, right? Which might not be the way that people think about, health. If you're having a hard time, you don't have health. But these people are defining well-being as, if I were having a hard time, I would have somebody to turn to. I would have people who are offering to support me and help me. And that's fascinating. That has to do with our sense of connection and belonging, and our sense of, maybe our innate sense that we know that things can be hard in life sometimes. But what would it mean to be well doesn't necessarily mean that we wouldn't have any hard time at all. But that we would have a sense of meaning that we could make from it, that we'd have a sense of hope for the future. That's something that people bring up with well-being too. And that we would have a sense of being supported and being cared for in the midst of our hard times. And when we think about this larger definition of health, you see people imagining healthcare in new ways. And it sort of gives us a chance as a populace, as a collective, to be like, what do we want to expect and demand, not only of ourselves and maybe the companies that we buy from or things like that, but also of our governments, of our policies, of our healthcare systems and facilities and things like that. If health if we can recognize that health doesn't have to be this relatively small thing of just what do we want to avoid, but if health is this larger thing about basically what does it mean to have a human experience?
What do I want to draw in to my life?
Yeah. We do see some innovation with this. A lot of my work in a model of care called Arts on Prescription, which is exactly what it sounds like. There are people around the U.S. and around the world. There are models of care where physicians and therapists can prescribe people experiences with arts and culture in the community in order to benefit their health. And we see that some of our studies have shown that, these have obviously, maybe not obviously to everybody, but to me, based on the literature, obvious positive impacts on the people who engage in the arts. But we also saw, you all will love this, positive impacts among the providers who were given the chance to prescribe these. They said, this expands our tool set because I have a lot to do. And this is my rephrasing of what they said, right? They have a lot that they can do when it comes to preventing things or helping to treat things. When it comes to supplying well-being, most healthcare providers don't feel like they have a lot in their, what would they do to supply people with a sense of meaning or purpose, to help people feel less lonely? They don't have a lot in their tool set for those kinds of things. And when they are able to be kind of brought into these arts on prescription models of care, suddenly they feel like they can connect people with more aspects of their health and well-being that, of course, as you can imagine, have ripple effects. Like you do something that gives you a sense of meaning, and that's going to ultimately likely affect maybe your symptoms of depression, your symptoms of anxiety, things like that they might be treating in other ways. So we saw what we were expecting was to see patients benefit. We weren't necessarily looking for the benefits to providers, but they were very clear that this was a tool in their tool set that they didn't have before, and also that it felt good to them to do it. Somebody said, this feels like prescribing beauty. This feels like prescribing joy. I don't get to do that. This is very new for me. And so, I think that when we recognize that health is a much larger thing than we've tended to define it, then we see all these
much more proactive.
Yeah.
Of course, I have more questions and more thoughts than we can do on this podcast, but I was thinking of what would be the consequence, or what would be the healing method if someone going into a doctor and rather than prescribing them Prozac, if they prescribed them and actually wrote a prescription out, this is the person that you will connect with to create this, and you're for this week it's a writing exercise. And it's to be done outdoors in nature for 5 minutes a day. I mean, we could transform the world if we were writing prescriptions like that. We really could. How pervasive is this? How do you see healthcare opening themselves to this? I think that we're seeing that now. Like, for example, all the studies, I recently finished reading the book, The Awakened Brain, and the studies that are being done on how spirituality affects well-being and longevity, and the studies that are out there now with how connectivity and relationships affect health and well-being and longevity.
Yeah.
I'm at a loss to think, how do we begin this huge transformation? Because at least in the United States, we are so locked into this kind of healthcare system that is doing nothing but prescribing pharmaceuticals. Tasha, help us. Help us.
Well, there are a lot of ways to think about potential solutions. As somebody who was on an antidepressant for a lot of years, and I feel like it saved my life in many ways, I would never want to say that, we shouldn't have those medications or that we shouldn't have those solutions for people. But we have seen that there's ways, there are some people for whom another alternative might work just as well, or especially. And we haven't done the studies around that are necessary. So I say that with a bit of a caution. Like, I think that there's some indication that some other alternatives could work just as well as what we call treatment as usual, but we need some more studies for that.
Yep.
Certainly on an individual by individual basis, we've seen that, but at the population level to make a recommendation, we haven't quite done that research yet. But we have seen the benefits of these kinds of things for what we might call adjunctive care, which is, if you're given a prescription for a given medication like Cymbalta or Lexapro for your anxiety or for your depression, then do you take it regularly? Or how are you feeling? Are you remembering to take your medication? How are you feeling on it? And how can we help you while you're taking the medication to kind of do some of the things that might cultivate, when you're depressed, you don't have any interest. That's often the main symptom. How do we maybe cultivate a new interest with you or help pique your curiosity as a human being so you have a sense of kind of forward motion in your life, a sense of again, hope for the future. A lot of times the things that we would do for that the medication doesn't magically do that. The medication can help you feel better and maybe sustain yourself for a bit. And then with that, we need to have some social connection. We need to have some ways that people get helped to find another path, to find their sense of meaning, their sense of curiosity and wonder in the world again. And I think, once we look at this, to your question about how pervasive is this as far as people looking at arts and prescription, it's more and more in the U.S. all the time. There are also some people like the New Jersey Performing Arts Center out east is working with Horizon Blue Cross Blue Shield. So there's even some, health insurance companies getting involved, and then a lot of philanthropic funding, a lot of grant funding for these things, and a lot of work being done to imagine, okay, once the scales, how is that going to get funded? But then there's a lot of economic questions that come in as far as long data that we've had in public health. When people are resourced, when you have a population that has the resources that it needs, how does that affect healthcare spending? Healthcare spending tends to go down because people are doing better in general. So the investments that we make to create communities and systems and models of care that take better care of people in fundamental ways winds up paying off because we are spending less on the kind of reactivity to, what we might say like negative and adverse things once they happen. There are fewer. There's maybe a decrease in those kinds of needs that we have because people are getting treated sooner or they have less problems because we've built a world that's designed for human thriving. And sometimes, Mary, when I'm talking with students, I will tell them about we're really good as a society of thinking about, if you're going to adopt a certain kind of dog, if you're going to go to a shelter and you found a husky and you loved that husky, but you live in like a studio apartment and you have no yard and you hate going on walks. We're pretty good as a society of looking at that situation and being like, you shouldn't get that dog. Like, that is not going to be good for the dog. Why is that? Because you would bring that dog home and in a couple weeks, that dog would be miserable. And it wouldn't be because it needed medicine or because it had a kind of like mysterious health problem. It would be because it's living in an environment that's not conducive to its ability to thrive. And we are not as good as a society at looking at human beings the same way and being like, what kind of environment do human beings need in order to thrive? And we could start at like literally the house you're living in, the air quality, the water quality, but also, do you have access to the things that you need in order to feel like you have a great life? For a husky, that's being able to run and pull things, right, for a tiny dog, it would be different, right? And humans are also incredibly diverse, but we can, I don't want to overextend the metaphor, but I think that you see what I'm saying as far as when we look at not just how do we react when something goes wrong for humans, but how do we build a world that's conducive to our thriving. I think that's where we see the best innovation and the largest impacts, the ripple effects that come from that are just massive.
Yeah. And I think of all the things that we have at our fingertips now that we didn't have before. And it's a matter of using all of these things together, not saying, oh, we should never take a pharmaceutical. We should only go, meditate in Tibet. And that's, you know what I mean? And it's not an either or. It's all those things that can come together to create the communities in which we can thrive. I see such a lack of that right now in our world, that it's either or. Either you see things this way or you're wrong. Yeah. Or you see things this way or you're wrong. But if we could glean the best from all worlds and provide, I love this visualization of providing that kind of community to ponder in the larger scale what needs to happen to create that community right here.
Yeah, we can. We can.
So as an individual listener, and most of my women listeners are women, not all, but about 85%, and most of them are between the ages of 35 and 55, so they're in that career family range. Some of them are as old as I am, not all. But as they look at how do I create this in my community, in my neighborhood, in my home, for myself, what are some of the first steps that they can begin to incorporate this wholeness that we seek?
I think the very first step when I'm working with organizations even is to look at the stories that we might have around this kind of idea, and specifically in our society in the U.S. and the West. Often we have been kind of trained to think of thriving as a reward. You get to thrive as a human if you were good enough, if you contributed enough. We don't think of thriving as a human right. So maybe it's a human right to be prevented from, accidents. We're like, okay, put up fences, put up signs. We think that's what you should do for everybody. Maybe it's a human right. Some people might even say it's a human right to get health care when you need it. I would say that. But when it comes to thriving, we have a lot of a scarcity mindset and a lot of closed fists around like, no. You only get to thrive if you prove to us that you deserved to thrive. And the haunting thing about that is that not only has, system effects as far as our policies and our systems and our communities, but we internalize that. And we can see that in, our hesitance to rest. I'm sure that a lot of your listeners might relate to this. Hesitance to rest, a hesitance to do things for ourselves, a hesitance to acknowledge that we might need something that we can't just go and take care of independently. We might need to ask for help. These things that we cut ourselves off from, or even things that we enjoy that we just don't do anymore, any number of things, because we've internalized the idea that you only get to have that complete physical, mental, and social well-being if you, quote unquote, earn it. And I understand that mentality because I too was born into that story, and I too was trained into that story. And it's really hard, but I think that we start to change the world when we start to question that story itself. Like, is that true? If that has been true in some way, do I want to continue to perpetuate that story for my own life, for my kids' lives, for the people that I love, and then also rippling out from that for the people in my community and the world? And because it's not an essential story, that's not the inevitable way to imagine the human species, that we get to maybe survive as a basic human right, but thriving we withhold until you prove to us that you earned it. I think that if we can question that, then we will start to build worlds where thriving is the expectation, where it's the demand. And that's, again, where that creativity comes into play. And part of what I study is how do you get people to question the stories that we've been handed, the things we've been told, like, this is just true, this is just how the world works. That's an inherently creative capacity to question those things and then to say, have I agreed with that in the past? Maybe. Do I want to continue to agree with that? And if I didn't agree with that anymore, what would I build? What would I do in my own life? And what would I build with my community? And I think that's where it starts, that, health is complete, physical, mental, and social well-being. It's not just the absence of disease. And the great thing is that those things are intertwined. And when we get really good at supplying well-being, there are economic effects. Even if you're only interested in the bottom line, there are economic effects of investing in people's
well-being.
Very
much so, yeah. Tasha, I could talk to you all day about this, but our time is up. So Tasha and her organization has created a landing page just for the listeners of Crafting a Meaningful Life. You can go there to that landing page. We've included the link at the end of the podcast, and there you will find how you can connect with her on LinkedIn, her website, the different work that she's doing, and stay connected to this idea of this is change. How things change. This is possible When I think about growing up in a world where everyone smoked, that was my growing up in 1950s. When I think of growing up in a world where the only seatbelt that I knew in a car was when my mom would put her arm out to keep me from flying into the windshield. And now I wouldn't think of getting into a car without buckling my seatbelt. And how the smell of smoke now is just really offensive to me. And we're seeing this change with alcohol. They're coming out with all these things about alcohol, honey, especially as you get older, it's really killing you. And we're seeing the actual use of alcohol decline for the first time in our history. Social change is possible. We have to first believe that it's possible and then embrace the ways that we can do that individually. Tasha, I think the greatest piece that I would like my listeners to kind of glean from what you have said today is that you have a key to the expression of art and beauty to allow people to discover their worth without doing. That is huge. As a victim of the doing society, I didn't believe that I had worth unless I did all these things.
Yeah.
And the Post-it notes that I wore. And did you check out the ones on my back? I have a lot of Post-it notes there. I don't want you to miss all the things that I've done. Okay. And rather than saying, it doesn't matter if you have 100 pounds to lose. It doesn't matter if you haven't had children yet. It doesn't matter if you're not making a living wage at this point. Your worth as an individual does not change about what you have and what you do.
Yeah.
And I know that you see people that way and that you give that safe place for people to be seen. So thank you for the work you're doing and for the loving essence that you have around you personally.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind. I would hope to help remind folks that we get to decide what stories we want to tell about ourselves and what we want to do with the stories we've received. And we always have, our story's not done until we are, right? We can always choose.
They aren't putting me out to pasture yet. Yeah, because I choose to still have a story that I'm telling. Thank you for being with us today and helping us see how we can be an active participant in crafting this meaningful life. And until next time, to all of my listeners, namaste. Namaste. I see the divine in you.
Crafting a meaningful life.